Hey everyone, Ryan here. Welcome to episode 2 of A Practical Legend. So I'm sorry this video took a while to make. I really wanted to get to it earlier, but after the first episode, I came down with a flu and I've just been bedridden for a while. But feeling better now. So let's get into this second episode. So just a quick recap. In the first episode, the discussion was on the importance of enemy level skips. And the main idea behind that video is that we want the enemy health level, at least from a damage perspective, we want enemy health to go up at a slower rate. And the slower this rate goes up, for any given amount of damage that we have, we are able to kill the enemies for a longer period of time, and so we can get natural wave progression just by having the same amount of damage. And that makes sense because enemy health is always going to grow faster than our damage can grow. So there is an upper bound to the amount of damage that we can possibly have, but this thing grows unboundedly. So in today's video, that first episode might seem to come across as, well, damage is not important. That is absolutely not true. Damage is still important, but I think more importantly than just knowing that damage is important, it's also important to know how the damage profiles actually look like. And so that's what I intend to cover today, the importance of understanding the different damage profiles that we can have in our own gameplay. So let's get started with that. Alright, so first and foremost, let me clarify what I mean by damage profiles. So every ultimate weapon that we have, say like inner landmines or poison swarm or chain lightning, smart missiles, they deal their damage in a very different way from one another, and that's what makes each of them unique in their own way. So depending on the types of battle conditions that we have, we are going to, some ultimate weapons are going to shine more than others, and also depending on the types of enemies that we are facing. So it's important to understand where each ultimate weapon is good in countering certain things, and where each ultimate weapon lacks in other things, so that we can build a good synergy around our ultimate weapons. So let's start off with chain lightning first. I think chain lightning, everyone really likes chain lightning. I don't think there's anyone who doesn't like chain lightning, especially in the early stages of progression. Chain lightning is probably the cheapest ultimate weapon to obtain. And part of chain lightning's appeal, to me at least, I think comes from the fact that naturally we are going to have pretty decent attack speed, right? We just let our attack speed lapse. This thing is pretty easy to go box as well, and so that's going to bring our attack speed up to quite a decent number. And once we have that, every bullet that we do, it's going to, in my case over here, it's pretty weak chain lightning, but 20% chance of a projectile to proc this chain lightning that splits into four different beams. Now, in my opinion, what I think chain lightning is good for is in spreading damage. Okay, so for each of these ultimate weapons that deal damage, there is some sort of an amplification modifier on the damage that it does. And for chain lightning, its main amplification comes from shock. So what shock does is it buffs all other damage sources on that particular enemy by a certain multiplier. And because chain lightning has this ability to spread across multiple enemies, if our shock chance is even relatively decent, it doesn't have to be maxed, we are going to be spreading that extra amplification to other enemies, which naturally just means that we deal more damage to those other enemies. And of course this also buffs further chain lightning damage on that particular enemy. Now with chain lightning, it's really good if we synergize it with the dimension core, specifically because it allows us to stack the shock up to a maximum of 20 times. So if shock is at 1.6 times, that if we get max shock on the enemy, that's going to be a 32x multiplier thereabouts on our enemy. In addition to that, Chain Lightning is also very good at taking out scatter enemies. Now, I'm sure everyone already knows these additional multipliers, right? So the way I see it, for Chain Lightning, the main benefit of Chain Lightning is to spread shock across multiple enemies. Of course, Chain Lightning damage is good, but after spreading the shock to the other enemies, it gives our other ultimate weapons added damage to kill the enemies. And when we get into, you know, high wave counts in Legends where enemy health is very, very high, yes, you might see that this number over here is much bigger than, say, my Smart Missile number or my Inner Landmine number, for instance. That does not necessarily mean that the initial hit of that Chain Lightning is going to chunk my enemy by a large amount, because when enemy health gets to like the AB kind of region, S damage is not going to cut it, right? It's not going to make a dent on much of the enemy's health. When that happens, we need other sources of damage. Okay, so now let's take a step back and think about what actually happens in a tournament run. For the most part, most of the basic type of enemies, we should be able to, you know, they just naturally die, either from death ray or from orbs. We are naturally going to trim out those enemies, and so they are not much of a concern. Where these enemies actually require us to pump out damage on them is when they have some sort of an ultimate weapon, an ultimate battle condition affix placed on them, or maybe they are bosses, or maybe they are fleets or elites. Now, if we were to think about what Chain Lightning actually does, which is to spread the shock and the amount of amplification that it provides to all our other ultimate weapons, then Chain Lightning is actually very good to spread the shock to all of those enemies that cannot be one-shot by our orbs and our death ray. And that allows our other ultimate weapons to, you know, take their time to destroy those enemies, benefiting from the extra damage. So that's the first thing. In addition to that, Chain Lightning is also very, very good for countering armored battle conditions. So, you know, right now I'm in a farming run. We have these enemies that block the first X amount of hits. So that means that the first few hits that I take on the enemy does not do any damage to them. Even if I'm able to one-shot the enemy, it's going to be registered as 0. Now, because Chain Lightning has this ability to split the quantity up, so each bullet has like, what, I don't know, a 20% chance to proc a Chain Lightning, and once we get a Chain Lightning, that Chain Lightning is going to split into 4 beams that is going to hit all the enemies around that enemy. This is what makes Chain Lightning really good, in my opinion. It's to just take out all of the armor stacks so that our other enemies our other ultimate weapons can start dealing damage on the enemies. Alright, so that is Chain Lightning. Now let's move on to Smart Missiles. Now, Smart Missiles, I say this quite a lot. I have a lot of sentimental value to this ultimate weapon. However, in the current meta, it's probably not very... it's underperforming slightly. Okay, but slightly is a overstatement. It's actually not doing very well. However, if we look at the amplification of Smart Missile has a 38.5 amplification. Okay, this means that each missile that hits the target is going to be higher than the previous missile by a factor of 38.5 times. Now, if we think about it, the the chain lightning amplification is only 32 times. Smart missile amplification is much higher than that, right? And don't forget that smart missile amplification benefits from the chain lightning shock, so there is going to be some synergy there. Now, what that means is that, bullet for bullet or bullet for missile, if we count the number of bullets that we shoot out and we count the number of missiles that we shoot out, assuming that they are the same number, the smart missile is going to be growing at a faster rate than the bullet chain lightning. And it's going to grow at a much faster rate because of this amplification here. The only thing is that, smart missiles, we are constrained by the quantity. Okay? And of course, it's a much longer cooldown than, say, firing like 50 bullets a second kind of thing. So where does smart missile actually benefit from? Well, in my opinion, when enemies are alive for quite a long time, and they are clumped up together, that's where smart missile damage actually shines. So imagine this. Imagine we have a protector that enters, and protectors don't die because they have that shield. And as a result of that, we have a whole clump of enemies in the protector, which I'm sure everyone has seen late in their farming runs. When that happens, say your shock is spread across all of those enemies now. However, you are not able to kill those enemies because naturally the enemies are going to have a lot of health towards the end of the run. At a time like that, smart missiles, if you're able to launch all your smart missiles onto that clump of enemies, they are going to benefit from all the shock multiplier and all of the amplification from the other people, from the other smart missiles. And so I think that's what makes smart missiles useful. Now, at least in farming runs, late on in the run, I tend to have issues with commander enemies. So what the commander does is it buffs, I think, the health and health regen of the enemies. I'm not sure what it actually does. But the enemies become a lot tankier and they take a while to die. When that happens, if they are all clumped up in my black hole, and my smart missiles have a lot of time to amp up, if I were to actually see the smart missile damage, okay, so typically my smart missile damage is going to be about 10% of my swamp damage, which is what we see around here. When one commander comes in, because of how long it takes to kill the enemies, I'm going to be ramping up a lot of smart missile amplification on those enemies, and that is going to bring my smart missile damage up to about 50% of my swamp damage. And so it grows a lot faster than either chain lightning or swamp when we have a clump of enemies that take a long time to die. So in my opinion, smart missiles useful for that very specific kind of situation. Now, the reason why it's lacking behind the other ultimate weapons, in my opinion right now, is because in version 27 we have this thing called mass enforcement, which means that if enemies take a while to die, they are going to get gradually more and more mass, and they are going to move closer and closer to your tower, and eventually they're just going to overwhelm you and kill you. That means that we don't have enough time to amp up our smart missile damage before that happens. Now, there are two ways around it, of course. If our quantity gets higher, then that ramps up the amplification a bit more. If our cooldown gets lower, that also ramps up the amplification a bit more. So we can sort of get around that a little bit. Or alternatively is we, especially in tournaments, if we have commanders, maybe we don't have op resistance, or maybe we don't have death ray resistance, and we are just going to let the ops and death ray just trim out the enemies that are being buffed by the commander enemy. So because of that, I think smart missiles loses out a lot of its value in the current meta, at least in tournaments. Now, from a farming perspective, I still rely a lot on my smart missiles, mainly because I don't have Chain Lightning Plus. Now, I'm not going to cover the Ultimate Weapon Plus versions right now because number one, I don't have them. But when we get to the stage of discussing the different types of battle conditions, I think that's when I will bring in the Ultimate Weapon Plus stuff. But for the interest of keeping things on track for this video, I'm just going to be focusing on the damage profile of each ultimate weapon. Alright, moving on to inner landmines. So inner landmines is interesting in a way. We can use it defensively or we can choose to use it offensively. So there's two things that we need to think about with inner landmines, right? If we just use inner landmines by itself, it's just this inner ring over here. That means that, you know, in all likelihood, it's going to be a boss or something that when they get very close to the tower, they get stunned by the inner landmine. In a situation like that, of course, we are using it defensively, and the only time that it would really matter is towards the end of the run when the enemies are very close to our tower. However, we have this module called the Space Displacer, this one here, that allows our landmines to have a chance of spawning as an inner landmine. And so if we equip our Space Displacer, enemies die around our black hole region. That's going to allow inner landmines to spawn. When this inner landmine spawn, naturally there will be enemies around them. They're just going to explode again, and they are going to just, you know, you'll be having this chain explosion of red on your screen, which is all coming from inner landmines. Now, my inner landmines are very weak. I've only got like a 55x multiplier on my damage over here. But with the Inner Landmine Plus acts as an amplification to inner landmines based on the duration of time that the inner landmine has not exploded. So when we think about using the Space Displacer build offensively, if the inner landmines proc near our black hole and they explode instantly, we don't really get that amplification. Which is what which basically means that we don't get that extra damage boost from our inner landmines. What the developers have done is they have introduced this lab, which is Chrono Jump. Okay, this Chrono Jump lab over here is going to boost the charge of the inner landmine by a certain number of seconds, depending on the lab that we have over here. So this naturally acts as an amplification to the labs, which allows us to use Space Displacer offensively. It's something that I'm trying to build towards. However, you know, with version 27, there's so many stone sinks available for us. I haven't really gotten around to unlocking my inner landmines yet. But I can foresee that because inner landmine explosion is much bigger than smart missiles, it's going to act in a very similar fashion where my explosions are going to buff up the amplification on the enemies, or they're going to benefit from chain lightning amplification, and they're going to be buffed by the chrono jump amplification. So I'm going to get pretty decent inner landmine damage on the enemies. Now, of course, it's worth saying that with inner landmines, you want your inner landmines to explode if you're using it offensively. So you kind of have to run a small range, which means that in certain types of battle conditions, especially if like there's fast ultimate or something, you might find yourself having a bit of variance in your runs because bosses might just zoom in straight to your tower. If you run a very small range. But anyway, we get to that when we talk about battle conditions and stuff. So inner landmines has its own use as well. where we can either use it offensively or defensively. And finally, for Poison Swamp. Now, very similar to Smart Missiles, Poison Swamp lost a bit of its value in version 27, in my opinion, because the way Poison Swamp works is, especially with its Ultimate Weapon Plus, it's going to be basically increasing the multiplier of the Poison Swamp tick, which means that we actually want our enemies to survive for a long time. And the longer that our enemies survive for, the more our Poison Swamp ticks for. And pretty easy to understand. Unfortunately, with the mass enforcement, enemies are going to inch closer and closer to your tower again if they survive for too long. So some of the issues that plague Smart Missiles is also going to plague Poison Swamp. However, Poison Swamp, in terms of its amplification, at least, back to that example with the commander enemies, when a commander fleet comes, I see that my Smart Missile damage creeps up from 10% of Poison Swamp damage to 50% of Poison Swamp damage during the fleet. What that tells me is that even though Poison Swamp is amping on the enemies, my Smart Missile amp is amping a lot faster than my Poison Swamp. So this, mind you, is with Poison Swamp plus 4 compared to Smart Missiles of nothing, right? So my Smart Missiles do amp a lot faster, and so that's where we get the different damage profile between the two ultimate weapons. However, Poison Swamp provides an additional source of stuns, and I think this stuns is what's really important in making Poison Swamp good, especially since we need time to damage the enemy. The stuns give us that additional time to damage the enemy, and because of that, I think that's why in the current meta, most people would go for Chain Lightning, which amps the damage of the enemies, and then to Poison Swamp, which allows us to deal more time, to give us more time to deal damage to that specific enemy. And yeah, I think that covers the 4 damage ultimate weapons that we have. So now, what are the damage profiles that each ultimate weapon is good for? Well, if we need a situation whereby Chain Lightning is, if we come across a situation whereby we need to deal very consistent damage to most enemies, then Chain Lightning is very good. If we need to remove armor stacks, Chain Lightning is also very good. Now, if enemies survive for a long time and they are clumped up together, Smart Missiles is very good for that. If enemies are, there are a lot of enemies that die very quickly, then Inner Landmines is very good. So what I have in mind with something like this would be, suppose there is no orb resistance, suppose we don't really have many enemy battle conditions available. Let's say we only have basic ultimate available, so there would be a lot of bosses. Now, Inner Landmines with a small range is going to be very good for that, just because our orbs are going to naturally kill a lot of enemies, which means that we're going to be having a lot of landmines spawning, which means that we'll have a lot of inner landmines exploding, which means that we stun the bosses a lot, and that gives our orbs and other ultimate weapons a lot of time to dish out damage to the bosses. Something like that. And finally, for Poison Swamp is great for just generally controlling enemies and wearing the enemies down over time with its damage. Alright, so that covers ultimate weapon damage profiles. I hope you found that useful, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Bye!